Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're diving into a fascinating research paper today called The Power of Commemorative Policies. Do street names influence people?
Sounds intriguing.
Yeah, it really gets you thinking, right? Can something as simple as a street name actually change how we think and feel about things?
It's a great question.
So this research wasn't just some theoretical exercise either.
Right.
They actually went out and did real-world research, talking to tons of people in Andalusia, Spain.
Yeah, hundreds of participants. It's pretty impressive.
Definitely. So let's start with the basics. Why are street names even important in this context? I mean, they're just names, right?
Well, think about it. Every day, we're surrounded by street names. I bet you can still remember the name of the street you grew up on.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
That's exactly what the researchers are getting at. Street names are part of our daily lives, whether we realize it or not, and they tend to stick with us.
Okay, so street names stick in our minds. What did the researchers actually find out about their influence?
Well, first off, they wanted to see how much people actually knew about the historical figures their streets were named after.
Makes sense. So, like, if my street was named after a famous scientist, would I be more likely to know about that scientist than someone who lives on a street with a random name?
Exactly. And you know what? They found that people were way more likely to be familiar with the person their street was named after.
No way, really. Even if they weren't, like, history buffs or anything.
Yep. Even when they controlled for things like education level and how interested people were in politics, the connection was still there. People on Scientist Street knew more about that specific scientist than people living elsewhere.
That's wild. So it wasn't just that those people were more knowledgeable overall. The street name itself seemed to give them this little knowledge boost.
Right. And they even looked at this guy, Isidro Alcalá Zamora. He was a Spanish political figure, and people who lived on his street were much more likely to be able to identify his profession compared to folks who didn't live on his street.
That's so interesting. It really highlights how our environment can kind of passively teach us things without us even trying.
Exactly. It's like this constant, subtle learning process happening all around us.
Okay, so maybe living on Scientist Street makes me know a bit more about that particular scientist. But does it make me think they were actually more important than other scientists? Like, does it actually shape my opinions?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's something the researchers dug into as well. What they found is that, yes, people living on a street named after a specific person were more likely to rate that person as the most important in their field.
Hold on. Seriously, just because their street was named after them.
It seems that way. Of course, it's not a simple cause and effect thing, but the connection was definitely there.
Wow, that's mind-blowing. I mean, it makes sense in a way. If we see a name every single day, it's probably going to stick in our heads more than a name we rarely come across.
Right, and that's where something called the availability heuristic comes into play. It's this idea that the easier it is for us to recall something, the more likely we are to think it's important or common.
Oh, I've heard of that.
Mm.
Like if I see a news story about a shark attack, I might suddenly think shark attacks are way more common than they actually are.
Exactly. And street names play right into that. The name is right there in front of you, easy to recall, so you might subconsciously start giving that person more weight in your mind.
So it's not like we're consciously deciding, oh, this person must be super important because my street is named after them. It's more like this sneaky subconscious thing.
It seems that way. And you know, this raises an even bigger question.
Yeah, I was just thinking that. Does this mean that just by walking down the street, our actual opinions, our beliefs are being shaped?
Right. I mean, what if those street names are influencing more than just what we know? What if they're shaping how we feel about bigger issues?
Ooh, now things are getting really interesting.
They wanted to see if street names could also influence deeper attitudes and values.
So not just facts, but like our whole worldview.
Exactly. And they focused on some pretty major areas like gender equality and attitudes about religious symbols.
I'm dying to know what they found out.
Well, to get into those details, we're going to have to dive into part 2 of this deep dive.
Okay, so before we went to part 2, we were in the middle of this really cool discussion about how street names might actually affect people's deeper attitudes, like about stuff like gender equality and religious symbols.
I got it.
Yeah, so let's jump back into that.
Yeah.
Did living on a street named after a woman Like actually make people more likely to have feminist views?
Well, the researchers looked into that, and the results are kind of fascinating. It wasn't a simple yes or no situation.
Okay, yeah, I figured it probably wouldn't be that straightforward.
It's always more nuanced than that, right?
Right, exactly.
But they did find some interesting patterns. Like they asked people how much progress they thought had been made toward gender equality in different areas, like social rights, job opportunities, the division of housework.
Yeah, those are all really important areas.
Yeah, and in areas where progress has been more clear-cut, like in social rights, the people living on streets named after women didn't really differ much from the other folks.
Interesting. So, no big difference there.
Right. But when it came to areas where progress has been slower and debates are more, heated, like the whole housework and caregiving,
Oh yeah, that's definitely still a big issue.
the people living on streets named after women were more likely to point out that, yeah, inequality still exists.
Huh. So it's like living on those streets maybe made them more aware of those problems.
It's possible, yeah. It's like those street names were acting as these subtle little reminders of those issues, kind of priming people to think about those things more critically.
Like they had a street sign whispering in their ear, hey, don't forget about this.
Exactly.
Okay, I love that. So what about the religious names? What did they find out about that?
So for that one, they did a separate online survey, and they showed people images of a crucifix in a town hall and a statue of the Virgin Mary in a town square.
Okay, so pretty classic religious symbols.
Right. And they asked people how they felt about those symbols being displayed in those public places.
Got it. So did people living on streets with religious names turn out to be more okay with it, with those symbols being displayed?
Well, the results weren't super clear-cut, but they did find this tendency for people on those streets to be a bit more accepting of the religious symbols.
Interesting. But, I'm thinking we can't just assume that everyone living on a street with a religious name is super religious.
Oh, absolutely. And the researchers definitely took that into account. They considered people's self-reported level of religious belief.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So what did they find when they factored that in?
They found that the whole street name thing had the biggest effect on people who already saw themselves as religious. Like, the street names seemed to reinforce their existing beliefs,
Yeah, I can see that. It's like if you're already sensitive to religious symbols, having that street name as this constant reminder might make those feelings even stronger.
Right, and for the people who weren't particularly religious, the street name didn't seem to have much of an impact at all.
So it's not like they were being brainwashed by street signs. More like those signs were kind of tapping into what was already there, maybe making those existing feelings a bit stronger.
That's a great way to put it. And it all goes back to what we were saying earlier about this idea of passive learning. Our surroundings are constantly shaping us, even if we're not really paying attention.
Wow. So that brings up an even bigger question, right? What does all this mean for how we form our beliefs and who we ultimately become?
Well, I think it really pushes us to think about how much of who we are is shaped by the places we live in, the things we encounter every day.
Yeah, that's huge. And do we even have enough time to really unpack that in this deep dive? All right, so we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into these street names. It's kind of wild to think that something we just walk past every day could actually be messing with our heads, like affecting what we think and believe.
Yeah, it really does make you stop and think, what other things in our environment are influencing us without us even realizing it?
Right, like we think we're making decisions on our own, but maybe there's all these hidden forces at play that we don't even know about.
Yeah, exactly.
So before we get too deep into that, there was one thing from the paper that we haven't touched on yet, and that was about how street names could influence people's political views.
Oh, right. Remember we were talking about that Spanish political figure, Niceto Alcalá Zamora, the one where people living on his street were more likely to know his job?
Oh, yeah, of course. Did living on his street actually make people like him more or think more highly of his political party or something?
Well, they looked at people's views on the Second Spanish Republic, specifically since Alcalá Zamora was president during that time. They wanted to see if living on a street named after him would make people look back on that era more favorably.
Okay, so basically testing if those street signs were turning residents into hardcore Second Republic supporters or something.
Pretty much, yeah. But the results were actually all over the place on this one. They found a tiny bit of a trend where people on those streets had a slightly more positive view of that period.
Okay.
But it wasn't statistically significant or anything.
So it sounds like maybe in that case, the street name just wasn't strong enough to overtower everything else that goes into our political beliefs.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, there's so much else going on there, right? Like
Mm.
family stuff, what we see in the news, our own personal experiences.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah.
But still, it makes you wonder, right? Like, is there some point where all those little reminders would actually start to change how we think about bigger issues?
That's a great question. Like, how much exposure to a certain idea or person does it take before it actually starts to change your perspective?
Yeah, it really makes you think about how we form our identities
Yeah.
and how much of it is influenced by just, like, the stuff we see around us all the time.
Absolutely. It's not just street names either, right? I mean, think about all the other messages we're constantly being bombarded with every day. Advertisements, the news, social media. It's crazy how much information is coming at us all the time, shaping our views without us even realizing it.
It's kind of overwhelming when you think about it like that. I mean, how can we even know which way is up?
Right. It's important to be aware of all these influences and to think critically about the stuff we're taking in. Like, where is this information coming from? What biases might they have? How is this affecting my own thinking?
Yeah, it's not about being cynical or distrusting everything, but it's more about, like, having a healthy dose of skepticism and being willing to question stuff, you know?
Absolutely. And that's what I think this research is really pushing us to do. It's not about saying that street names are brainwashing us or anything,
Right.
but it's more about understanding that they are one little piece of a much bigger puzzle.
I love that. It's like we're all constantly being shaped and molded by the world around us. And once we understand that, we can start to make better choices about who we want to be.
Exactly. Maybe we can even start to build environments that encourage more positive values, you know? Create a world that reflects the best parts of who we are.
Well, that's an awesome thought to end on. I think we've officially reached the end of our deep dive today. And I got to say, this has given me a whole new way of looking at things. I don't think I'll ever look at a street sign the same way again.
Me neither. It really shows you that you can find something fascinating in even the most ordinary stuff if you just take a closer look.
Thanks so much for joining us today on The Deep Dive. We hope you've enjoyed exploring the weird and wonderful world of street names. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.